Oh, good morning, Wayne State. I'm glad you're tuning in. I'm glad both of our fans are listening. Just a little bit of introduction. Welcome back to Sobremesa. It's a show where we talk about ideas, and each week we feature a new professor or faculty member here at Wayne State. And this week our guest is Dr. Frederic Pearson. He's of the Political Science Department, and he studies world politics.
Thanks. And we also direct the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, where students can take a co-major.
Cool. Okay, so Dr. Pearson, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up working at Wayne State, where you studied things like that?
Well, I originally studied at graduate work at the University of Michigan, where they had in those days the unusual program called the Center for Conflict Resolution. And while I was in political science and international relations, I also met up with some of those people who study how to reduce conflict from various disciplines, psychology, sociology, history, and so on, even physics, because there's a lot of nuclear issues and so on. So that sort of caught my interest. Then I went to St. Louis for 20 years or so in the Center for International Studies and Political Science at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And then I had a chance in 1990 to come back here to Detroit and head the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, which I was their first faculty director. It's been going for 52 years, the center. Was one of the first in the country to study and teach about war and conflict internationally and domestically. So we've kept that going, and we've done a lot of work since then. And that's how I came to be here.
Cool. So with the development of a Peace and Conflict Studies department, what was there before the systematic study of conflict? Was there anything that people studied before that?
Well, sure. I mean, people in history studied wars and how they came about. Historians like to view that as each one is different, all kinds of details about any given war is unusual and peculiar to that situation. Political scientists have been studying conflict like this for, decades. Quincy Wright was a famous guy in the 40s who first studied a systematic way of looking at war. And I think political scientists tend to generalize more than historians. They like to say power imbalance almost always can lead to war. If an up-and-coming power challenges an existing power and there's clash there, it can lead to war. Doesn't always, but can. So they look for regularities and generalizations more. Both of them are necessary. You got to look at history. Anybody who's in office these days and doesn't know the history, let's say, of the Korean War, won't have a clue about what's going on with North Korea and the dynamics of China and its interests, how China can't just be expected to yawn and say, okay, knock out Korea, because they once fought a war with us over that,
right,
coming too close to their border. And they didn't even have nuclear weapons, and we did, and they still had a 1 million-man army invade and give us more than we bargained for in the Korean War. So if you don't know those facts and historical patterns, you're unguided. And I'm afraid some of our current leadership may not know much about that kind of stuff.
So for students that haven't decided if they want to focus on political science or just be history majors, how would you help them decide the correct path that they might?
I think that students should always do what interests them the most.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no real guarantee of any kind of career out of any discipline. I mean, you're going to have to show your worth and apply and all that kind of stuff for jobs. There are better preparations for different kinds of work. Let's say you want to go into government work. Political science can be a very good preparation for that. But it also needs a little touch of history too, and economics. So be prepared to combine things a little bit. And I think Wayne's new dictum that just, I think, came down, that students have to have a minor, at least in liberal arts. So
right.
Liberal arts students now have to have a minor. It's not a bad idea to get them a little more diversified and add credentials that can be of interest to employers and so on. But either way, I mean, if you're interested in politics, I found myself in high school writing notes to people, satirizing political events. So I didn't even know it. I wanted to be a dentist. But little by little, it dawned on me that, I'm really interested in political stuff, and it's kind of a junkie. And that's sort of what I finally realized I better do. Even in political science, by the way, you have a parting of the ways usually. If you study political science, some people want to go to law school, and other people want to go into teaching, or other people want to go into government work. They can lead in different directions. And I considered law for a while, and it was a close call, but I decided to do graduate work and go into teaching. But, people can have different orientations about that and should examine their own interests.
When did you decide to go to college? Did you do it right after high school?
Yeah, but I was the first in my family to do it. Wayne is famous for that, first in the family. Even now, I think, probably. A lot of young people who are still the first in their families come here. And I think that's great, to have a university like that, where you can branch out and not pay. I mean, I know it's expensive, but it's not like some of the totally expensive places in private colleges. I sort of broke the mold. I don't think my parents expected me to get an education like that. They expected me to go to work, quote unquote. I even had relatives who have said to me, I work so you can do what you do. There are some people who just don't understand higher education and don't, place that much value on it. But I laugh that off and try to see the value, which is great,
Right.
I think some of our voters, our voting patterns, are very much distinguished by people who have gone to, university or who haven't. That's not to denigrate those who have not, because they can often be very streetwise and very, common sense oriented. So they certainly have good judgment, but I think people who have gone to college and seen different nuances, we call it critical thinking, see things from both sides, be able to argue two sides of a question. In political science, we like to sort of rate one set of hypotheses, we call them hypotheses, versus a different set of hypotheses, and see where the evidence leads us. Those people are used to looking more carefully, I think, at more deeply at things, and we need that. I don't think this society values it enough. We don't pay our teachers well enough in schools. We don't pay enough credence to intellectuals, quote unquote, who study things in depth and read a lot. There's a kind of a tendency to make fun of those people, but I think it's very valuable to have that capability.
When you first were starting out in academics, you had some criticism from people that said they paid or they work so that you can do what you do. Was that something that you had to overcome personally, or was it something that was never a problem to you?
Just get over it. My mother said, you for all the years you studied, you could have been a real doctor. And of course, I have a PhD technically I'm a doctor,
Doctor of
but I'm not a real doctor, So
Right.
That's kind of a mother joke. But yes, I mean that's you're going to run into misunderstandings all over the place.
Right.
Just grin and bear it.
It was different times too, right? I mean, a lot of
Yes.
people could go into the workforce right out of high
Exactly.
school.
That's one of the problems with Detroit, of course. Not problems, but great part of Detroit was that you could have a meaningful income and pretty good life without going much further than the high school, or even maybe not even finishing a high school education. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case, and unfortunately as well, we've been left with a lot of people who are not fully literate, whose reading skills are skimpy, and that has had an impact on their kids and their schools, and how much support they get from those families, and also on people's options to do different kinds of work. I happen to be a Rotarian, a Rotary, and by the way, there's a junior Rotary at Wayne State called Rotaract. Has a major project in Detroit that Worldwide Rotary has supported, which is about adult literacy, to teach adults who may not have full literate skills how to do better in reading and in math and all kinds of things that they need in everyday life. So organizations like that have been important in recognizing some of these challenges in our society.
So, not to make too harsh of a segue, but speaking of illiteracy, I want to touch on world leaders now. We currently have one.
Why were you looking at me when you said that word? What are you trying to say?
Well, we currently have a world leader who, in our country, is personally in my opinion, a little less than literate in some respects. So I want to ask you, do you think that who the specific world leaders are in a given country really matter when it comes to what is going to happen in international politics?
Well, that's a very good question. We talk about this, as you know, in our classes a lot. There are three different sort of levels that impact what happens in world politics. Who is the individual leader? What is the country like that they're leading? And what is the world situation or system around that country? So it's not enough to know who the leader is. Yes, Vladimir Putin, for instance, makes a big difference in assertion and nationalism and, the orientation of the Russian foreign policy. But even he faces what we call role variables, that, there are pressures on him by the other oligarchs, shall we say, in the country who want this or that amount of money or whatever. There is the military in a country that campaigns for budgets or that limits you and says, no, Mr. President, we can't do this. You have to realize, that there's consequences to X, Y, and Z move. There are agency heads who have to deal with education in the country or whatever it might be who pressure that person. So, yeah, that person can change a lot. They can replace some of those heads in various departments and get their own people in there and go, have sycophants who do what they tell them to do. We've seen some of that. But there is always going to be some pressure. And in a so-called democracy, you also have public opinion pressure to a greater extent. It's true even in Russia, of course, that the war in Afghanistan probably ended partly because the Russian public said enough of dying, our guys dying there for what purpose, a little like Vietnam, and it's time to get out. So, even leaders who are very assertive have to sort of pay attention to what's going on around them. But you wonder, though, about somebody who's so reactive that they might just start something in order to keep themselves in office. If you look at the situation in Syria, the degree to which the Assad family and the president has gone to put down rebellion rather than negotiate with opponents is harrowing, and then he gets help from outsiders to do that. So it may be okay to try to stay in power, but how much are you going to sacrifice your country to do that?
Right.
Seems like a clear example of a country that's sacrificing a lot of the well-being of the people is North Korea, just for the leader to stay in power.
Well, that's another family dynasty, of course, the Kim family, and they've now in their third generation, and we just saw the sister of Kim Jong-un emerge. I guess she's competing with Ivanka Trump for the best Olympic visit. Anyway, yes, you can really victimize a country by having those pretensions that you want to stay in power no matter what. I think that regime is so reactive to the idea that it would be overthrown that they're willing to do or say almost anything to keep other countries from interfering in what they do. So I think they see the nuclear capability, not so much, they may rattle the sabers and show the cartoons of the missiles hitting New Orleans or something like that. They actually couldn't find New Orleans very well on the map when they tried that cartoon. But that's a little bit of a display thing to say, stay away from us. Don't mess with us. We can cause trouble. And then you get this competitive thing with our president saying we got bigger buttons than you have, which make it very ridiculous. But again, it's for show to say don't mess with us either. So. Yes, it's disturbing that a leader like that can be so repressive, but there are reasons that North Korea does what it does, and it's not completely off the wall. I mean, when they do a stunt, you can almost always say that something that we've done earlier has provoked them, and vice versa. And it's usually that the U.S. and the South Koreans have done some military exercise together, some training exercise off the coast or whatever. And almost predictably, North Korea will do some crazy stunt to say, you can't get away with stuff with us. And then we, of course, bristle at that and say, you can't tell us what to do, and we'll do more. Instead of doing what needs to be done, which is having a peace treaty from the Korean War, actually negotiating that, We do little bits of back and forth and maybe a peace feeler or two, a common Olympic team. Hopefully we can lead to more serious negotiations. China and Russia told us that if you pull back and quit your exercises, we will do everything we can probably to get North Korea to freeze their nuclear program. The Trump administration didn't want to play it that way and immediately rejected that idea. But again, pressures build, and even the Trump administration has sort of dabbled with openings, possibilities. They don't go very far. But it should disturb us all that the Korean War was never settled. And we're sitting there with one of the most militarized borders in the world where any kind of accident could occur. Accidental, incident that scares everybody into overreaction. So we need to really chill that down and have a final settlement of the Korean War where we would recognize North Korea for better or worse, and they would establish normal diplomatic relations.
And do you think South Korea allowing North Korea to compete in the Olympics this year is a step forward into making negotiations with them?
Yes, I mean anything like that is a step forward. We have, but you can't overestimate it. Sports is sports. I know you had just had a program about sports.
Right.
And in history we had a ping pong team that went to China earlier than the actual recognition of the People's Republic by the U.S. We had what we call ping pong diplomacy. They're big on table tennis there,
right.
And they're very good at it. And so we had some visits by delegations back and forth to play ping pong with each other. That conditioned the public to get ready for possible better relationships. The reason to have the actual deal, though, was bigger calculations by Nixon and Kissinger at that time, and Mao, that they both wanted to oppose Russia, or the Soviet Union. So reason to get together is my enemy's enemy is my friend kind of thing, and you can all use that as kind of a guide as when things get better. We've had thaws in the North Korean relationship in the past. Sometimes in the early 2000s there were family visits back and forth, family reunions. That makes perfect sense, right? For the Koreans to, actually be able to visit their family across the border. That happened in Germany too. It was called Ostpolitik, when East and West Germany still were divided. A feeler from the Chancellor of Germany, West Germany at the time, Willy Brandt, called Ostpolitik, opening to the East, set the stage for eventual reunification possibilities. It took the fall of the Soviet Union to have that happen, but it did happen. And we don't know the future of the Koreas. The younger generation, your ages, we're told, is less interested in North Korea than their fathers and grandfathers were, and want to do stuff with Japan. And well, actually, they don't like Japan so much, but others, and they want to do other things in the world. But there are still South Koreans who are very reactive to North Korea. So the public has to be prepared, get ready to have a change in relationships. And that won't be easy with this regime in North Korea, which won't want to give up its throne.
Right.
Have you heard about the doomsday clock?
Yes, that's been in existence for years during the Cold War. It was, I think, the nuclear scientists were warning everybody, in a sense, that the clock is ticking close to midnight. We got to do something about the potential of nuclear war. One of the things we've done here at the Center for Peace and Conflict this year is have a series of panels in the community called Nukes in Your Future, where we have 2 physicists and 2 political scientists go around to public gatherings and talk about nuclear weapons, because people weren't paying much attention for a long time. When the Cold War ended, it seemed like the Soviets and the Americans were on a good relationship, and we were better, and we were diminishing our nuclear arsenals. Now, of course, you see this again, sort of saber rattling. We just saw it yesterday with Mr. Putin getting on TV and saying, we've got new nuclear weapons, new nukes that can reach anywhere, and showed a cartoon of them unloading over Florida getting, the missile carrier, and then the warhead breaks loose, and you see several bombs ready to go over Florida. Turns out, by the way, that cartoon is old. It was, I think, used maybe 10 years ago for a similar demonstration, and it's kind of odd because the North Koreans do that too, cartoon capers, so to speak, of potential nuclear attack. You shouldn't trivialize something like that, but it's meant as a warning. And you wonder, by the way, if the North Koreans and the Russians are both doing that, do the Russians advise the North Koreans on their use of the missiles? I mean, is there any real relationship going on there? We think of China, but Russia may be involved. They're close. But intelligence estimates say that nothing really has changed much. Both countries are developing nuclear capabilities. It's alarming. The U.S. is spending billions, close to $1 trillion under Obama and now Trump, to so-called modernize our nuclear weapons. And with Trump, it's even more than just modernize. It's evidently creating systems that are more usable, which should alarm everybody.
What does that mean?
Well, evidently it's less blast, smaller explosions, but still nuclear explosions, to go after targets maybe like underground facilities in a country like Iran, or to be used in war situations against maybe terrorist targets, like ISIS concentrations. We don't know exactly, but there's this evident move to design new nuclear weapons, and we're doing it too, to make them useful. I mean, Trump has said, I think he said, why are we spending so much money on weapons we can't use? So he doesn't really fully understand, perhaps, the idea of deterrence, which is that they shouldn't be used. They must not be used. You must be in a situation that no one thinks they could get away with anything. That's the whole essence of mutual assured destruction, which is kind of debatable as a strategy because it's called MAD. You got to say, we can't defend ourselves, you can't defend yourselves, and we shouldn't try. We should just say we would totally destroy each other, and therefore don't try anything. The opposite tack seems to be happening. Both sides saying, well, maybe we can use them, and you can't stop us, and all this kind of stuff. It's true that our defensive systems wouldn't knock down all missiles. So this should alarm people. And I think that's why we're going around with this panel, to sort of educate and update people about what's happened with nuclear weapons. If, for instance, Iran did get nuclear weapons, who would be next to get them? It's pretty predictable. You tell me, who do you think?
After Iran, well, I think there'd definitely be a bigger opportunity for subnational groups to get them after that.
Well, that's a concern, of course, but the country that would be most likely would probably be Saudi Arabia. Certainly they can afford them. They could buy them off of Pakistan or somebody who's desperate for money. And they would want to, because they're in this big confrontation with Iran all over the Middle East. Again, you got to know what's happening everywhere. Iran and Saudi Arabia are in a Cold War, major proportions in the Middle East. That's what's driven the Syrian civil war to go on and on and on and on. Iran on the side of the government, Saudi Arabia on the side of rebels. They're both fiercely afraid, Saudi's fiercely afraid that they're going to be overthrown. That's another dynastic family, Saud family. And so these guys cling to power like mad, and they're willing to spend anything and do anything to offset their major opponent who threatens their rule, in this case, Iran. So that would unleash a further arms race in the Middle East, and that's the last thing we need. Again, you speak of groups that could get these weapons too, from a country like Pakistan, if it should fall apart. That's why it's complicated. The U.S. may be frustrated at times with Pakistan, but we just cannot let our relationship fall apart. Donald Trump has criticized our ally, Pakistan, pretty harshly, but you can't ignore the fact that they are the only Islamic country with nuclear weapons, and if they fell, who would be getting those weapons? Where would they go? The fall of Libya should illustrate that to us. Under Obama, we didn't think twice about taking out Gaddafi. And the result was terrible in terms of the unleashing of weaponry, not nuclear weaponry, but unleashing of conventional arms all over the place in North Africa. creating many more firestorms of violence when you just do something without careful calculation. So again, if we want to let things go unchecked, then a Middle East arms race with nuclear weapons is pretty scary. Israel, by the way, does have nuclear weapons, and people don't always remember that, so that adds to the mix. This is why we have to be diligent in, I think, campaigning for less nuclear weapons. And Obama was very concerned about that. He made that his watchword of his presidency. I don't think he achieved a lot in that regard, but he made it a watchword and reminded us all that they're still there. They're still there, and they could destroy the world.
So you said you worked with these panels, or at least you know about these panels that go around informing people about nuclear
I've
weapons.
been on them.
What does it take to get the people to not want nuclear weapons in a country?
Well, you know, we're the Japanese are a good example of this. Of course, they're allergic. You know, you can understand why.
Right.
They'd be allergic to nuclear weapons. The only country that has ever been victimized by them. But even there's pressure on Japan as North Korea arms nearby, and a hostile sense about Korea and Japan. They don't particularly like and trust each other. There's a lot of pressure on Japan to change its stance. But as far as the public in Japan is concerned, very, very opposed, I think, to having nuclear weapons or seeing them developed in that area. We've had some success stories in the world which don't get much attention. We have Latin America has declared itself a nuclear-free zone. You could have countries like Brazil and Argentina getting nuclear weapons. They're perfectly capable of it.
Lots
They
of
have
resources.
enough scientists, enough money, and so on. But they've decided if one got them, the other would get them, and then where does that end up? It ends up nowhere. It ends up, you know, in stalemate. So why waste your resources and do something like that? Instead, they have jointly articulated a nuclear-free South America. South Africa, under the white regime, had nuclear development and then abandoned it, actually abandoned the weapons when the majority rule came. Maybe it was out of fear that the whites got rid of them, but that's a success story of denuclearization. So and even the U.S. and the Russians went down from something like, I don't know, I think it was like 11,000 nuclear warheads on each side or more to roughly 4,000, which is too many. But we did decrease in a major way. In fact, that was part of the deal in something called the Non-Proliferation Agreement for World Arms Control. Most countries don't have nuclear weapons and don't intend to get them. And in return, what they said was, just give us peaceful nuclear energy we can use in energy production and electricity and in medicine and stuff like that. And we won't get the nuclear weapons. But we ask that the nuclear powers, the now 7 or 8 countries in the world that have them, get rid of them, or gradually get rid of them.
And in order for that to be successful, I mean, the country that has the most nuclear missiles would have to lead by example, right? They would be
Right.
the ones who would have to
Yeah,
take
they have to get together and say, look, let's take it down major levels. One of the things that was argued, though, in Washington is that you can't go too low, or that China will be able then to equal you.
Right.
Well, China's going to equal you anyway, you know, eventually, right? I mean, all the trends point to China's development of things, hopefully not so much nuclear. But I think we need to come to some understandings with each other about jointly diminishing the numbers. China doesn't want the U.S. and the Russians to have an overwhelming capability greater than theirs. So maybe something could be done along those lines. We've seen these kinds of problems historically before the nuclear era. Back in the 1920s, after the First World War, there was a lot of arms conferences of naval arms, let's say. And can we control the level of naval armament that Japan would have a certain level, Britain would have a certain level, the U.S. would have a certain level, Germany, etc., and can you agree on quotas? Well, the agreement sort of fell apart because Japan was on the march and wouldn't stick to the inferior position they wanted to give them. So you got to overcome that, but that's part of negotiation. That's real negotiation. And we hear our government talk a lot about how great they are at negotiating.
The best.
The best. But I think that the way our current leader negotiates is maximalist.
Well, he doesn't negotiate, right?
Well, he thinks he does, but he says the most maximal kind of thing, give up or else. And there's no flexibility about it, but maybe we can, and then he'll tweet, maybe we can, accommodate something, and, So I think what he expects is you start the maximum, he's used to this probably, and that's how you buy a car, I won't pay more than X.
Right.
Under any circumstances. I'll walk out if I have to. But then you sort of soften it when the dealer says, okay, maybe I can throw in this or that, and he's kind of, I think that's how he sees negotiation, a kind of business context. But this isn't business context.
Right.
There's a different way of you doing diplomatic negotiations, which get more real. Show some opportunity forthcoming, without trying to bludgeon your opponent to submit first. I think there's a difference.
And do you think denuclearizing is actually going to be able to happen in this world, where there's always fear?
Yes, because what we've seen is the moments when you get real, shall we say, are the scary moments. If you look, if we need to remember some history again, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, the world got so close to nuclear war that even the leaders weren't aware of the near miss, because certain Russian naval commanders were ready to launch nuclear torpedoes to show they could sink an American ship with nuclear weapons. That was stopped at the last minute by the commander of the fleet, the Russian commander of the fleet, who said, we can't do that, Captain." But no one knew that had happened until they had reunions later, where they sort of drank with each other and said, "Did you know that we almost did this and that?" It's the crisis, however, did scare everybody enough that they began to get serious about arms control. That's when you got the first hotline between the U.S. and Moscow to say, this move we just made, we're not attacking you. Don't worry. Don't get upset. That's when we got the first test ban agreement to stop testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. That was a terrible practice that we were doing for decades, is testing these arms in the atmosphere, where all of the fallout would go into milk supplies and affect thyroid glands of children, and no one paid any attention to that until they were scared by the near miss of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That then got into something called SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation, under the Johnson administration, where you said, okay, let's have limits. Let's have ceilings on each side of how many nuclear weapons. And then it was START under the Reagan administration, Strategic Arms Reduction. Let's not just limit it, but reduce it periodically, systematically. You build trust on each side. So trust building is a key to this. And reacting to fear is hopefully part of human learning.
Mm-hmm.
Does any of what's going on right now to you resemble the game of chicken?
It's funny that you mentioned that. There are two games we talk about in world politics a lot with the students, particularly. One is called the prisoner's dilemma game, where the two prisoners are interrogated in separate rooms, and they could both be better off if they didn't confess. But because one fears that the other will turn them in and do them in, they both confess, and they both go to jail. So they're both worse off. Well, if they could trust each other, and their word was valid, and there was a way of, Reagan used to use the term trust but verify. If you could have a way of verifying, that's a Russian proverb, by the way, trust but verify, then you could lower the tension and both be better off in the prisoner's dilemma situations like nuclear. The other game that we talk about is the game of chicken, which is patterned after highway mobs in California in the 1950s, where these teenagers would supposedly drive at each other in a single-lane road, and the one that swerved would be chicken.
Mm-hmm.
The one that, veered off would be chicken, and all their gang members would be impressed by the courage and the moxie of the one that didn't, or the craziness. The game is a crazy game, because if you don't swerve, you're both dead.
Right.
So how do we how do we implant the situation where you both swerve, which is the dominant outcome? Because you're afraid of dying, generally they'll both swerve. That's what we think is going on with the Russians and the Americans. They may prepare new weapons and stuff like that and rattle sabers in cartoons, but basically they know that they're allies against mutual non-existence. I mean, these are such dangerous weapons that everybody knows if something starts, it could blow us into extinction.
Right.
So you're essentially allies against non-existence, no matter what you say. And the point is, can you bring people to their senses about swerving? And anything you do, therefore, that tries to overcome that is not sensible. If you try to knock down the weapons that are incoming, then that signals to the other side that you think you can get away with starting a war. So the overemphasis on defensive missiles, anti-missiles, as we call them, ABMs, are probably destabilizing. In fact, Putin said yesterday, this whole thing started that we felt we had to redo our nuclear weapons because the U.S. withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. I think we withdrew a few years ago because we want to use these so-called THAAD and systems against smaller powers and have defensive missiles against smaller powers. But it gives a signal to the big power, hey, you think you can get away with something? You think you can knock down our arsenal? No, we're going to show you can't knock down our arsenal. So you don't try anything. That's the essence of that chicken game, which I think needs to still be played in the sense that you don't try anything. Don't try any nuclear stunt.
So you're for the chicken game.
It's a stupid game. You shouldn't be playing it. We'd like to get rid of these nukes. It's too dangerous. But if you're playing the game, then play the game. Don't try to outsmart the game and think you can get away with forcing your opponent to swerve.
Right.
In the chicken game, some Harvard strategists came up with the best way to play chicken. Throw your steering wheel out the window. So the opponent sees that you can't swerve. They've got to swerve. Well, that means you lose control. The best way to play the game is to lose control or show your opponent that you lose control. Oddly enough, by the way, since they both are playing the game, they both throw their steering wheels out the window and show each other they can't swerve, and then you have war. Then you have, mutual destruction. That's how World War I started. Both the German leader and the Russian leader, they were cousins, the Tsar in Russia, the Kaiser in Germany, on different sides, different alliances, threatening each other. And they said to each other, no, you have to stop, I can't stop. No, you have to stop, I can't stop. These were the famous Nicky and Willie notes, because they're cousins. Mm-hmm. But it's all up to you, Nicky. Come to your senses. I'm not going to give in. I can't. There's too much pressure on me by my military. You have to give in. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of crazy lose control kind of thing that shouldn't happen. That's why, by the way, ideally, civilians do control the military and don't let local commanders just start something. We have the weird situation in this country right now that appears that the military is saner than the civilian commanders. And they may want to be less involved in wars than the civilian might tell them to be. So that's a concern, not losing control.
Right.
Do you think that there's ever been an example of a country where it doesn't care if it has a head-on collision? Like a world leader?
Yeah, Hitler probably doesn't. It comes to mind. Even he, of course, called off invasions when he had a stomach ache or whatever, and didn't carry through always, but he eventually carried through and invaded everywhere he could. He vastly overestimated his capabilities to defeat the Soviet Union. That's what brought him down, essentially, the overcommitment to attack Russia. They used to say about Hitler, he said he wanted a 1,000-year Reich, which means a 1,000-year empire. Well, somebody said, if you want a 1,000-year empire, you shouldn't mess around so much in the first 12 years. So he was way into overcommitment. But he wasn't stupid, and he was, unfortunately, and he got away with a lot of stuff before he finally overdid it.
Right. So for someone who studies world politics, where do you get your current news from?
It's a good question. I get a lot from the New York Times and Washington Post, and but there are BBC, French Agence France, Middle East, Al Jazeera stuff. Some of the blogs are pretty good in terms of sometimes getting decent articles, like Slate. You can't just do one thing. You got to triangulate, but stick to quality stuff. So-called. Oddly enough, the Christian Science Monitor is one of the best newspapers. The Economist, the British, rather conservative but well-analyzed stuff. The Wall Street Journal analyzes things well in their articles. There are serious media on both sides of the fences that study things in depth, and you just have to find those and not be swept away by sort of fly-by-night, news sources. If you're going to listen to CNN, probably is something to listen to. MSNBC and Fox, of course, are extreme on either side. CNN, I think, tries to come up the middle a little more, but that's useful. But you need to add in, and there are all kinds of quality things on the internet if you know how to distinguish between quality and junk. Looking through the library system here at Wayne State to get articles online is a good way to try to quality control what you're getting and use valid sources.
And for someone that doesn't have like university access to find those quality sources, what would you recommend for them to do in order to find like good quality sources outside the university?
Stick to the known things to a great degree. I'd say the BBC is a good starter. It's not going to be overly American. It's not going to be overly Middle Eastern, or even in the British case, they're not controlled by the government, even though they are a government-backed entity. These kinds of things can give you good initial accounts of things. The Guardian newspaper in Britain, which is noted as being a little on the left, nevertheless is one of the best coverages of the Syrian war. Who's on what side? Who's getting help from what country? You can't always rely 100% on these reports, but anybody that still sends correspondence overseas and doesn't take secondhand news as their only way of expressing it is worth looking at.
Okay.
Because that's the way you normally got good information, is from correspondence on the spot in various parts of the world. So if you find places that actually give bylines to reporters who are stationed overseas, that's a good start.
I think Wayne Radio needs to.
Wayne Radio is the other one. That's right. And
Especially in this show.
And frankly, WDT.
I think we need to invest in a war correspondent.
That's right.
Well, I think with that we can shift into our more off-topic segment, and I guess we can.
Right. What do we have today, Jake?
Well, let me go through our sponsors for today's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Starbucks. Starbucks.
I wish I thought of a $3 cup of coffee. That's all I can say.
Starbucks. You could go to Tim Hortons, but you're not in Canada. And we're also sponsored by Dean's, making quality, ultra-pasteurized, original dairy whipped topping, grade A, and sweetened since 1925. It's a lot of information, Dean's. That's really a mouthful, but it tastes great. So thank you.
All right. Also, during this segment, we will take any text from whoever's listening. They can be directed to Professor Pearson or Jake and myself. The number to text in is 313-451-2909. Again, 313-451-2909.
Can we get some sound effects as Jake pours his Starbucks coffee into his cup here, so you know where this sponsorship thing is coming from? I think truth in advertising here is required.
Yeah.
So we didn't get any sound from the pouring of the Starbucks hot chocolate, but Dean's, since 1925, has been offering great sound effects with their Cool Whip.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that great? So, for you, Dr. Pearson.
Oh, thank you.
So did anyone text in any questions yet? I'm sure our listeners...
Not yet. So, Dr. Pearson, are you ever worried that the way history is written, it's usually written by winners of wars?
Exactly. They say history is his story,
Right.
History. the winners tend to write things, or actually to redo things in their own preference. You wonder why the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are the U.S., Britain, France, Russia, and China. They were the winners in the Second World War. Notable countries that probably are influential and should be given a permanent seat on the Security Council, countries like Japan, Germany, not to mention India and Brazil, maybe, some others, South Africa, are not on there. They're on there, but they rotate on and off. They're not the permanent members with a veto. So the system that's set up, and in this case I think it's a pretty good system, set up in this case by mostly democratic states, is definitely designed by the winners in most cases. You might wonder why there were no war crimes trials of Western war criminals in the Nuremberg era when the Germans and the Japanese were being charged, and rightly so. It's because of, it wasn't in neutral hands. The Nuremberg trials were conducted by the West, not by the Swiss or the Dutch or some other neutralist type country. So I think we probably need to afford more influence and representation to various countries from various backgrounds. Many countries in the world will emphasize economic development and aid. The Americans and the Russians and others tend to give aid for their own purposes. Even the Trump administration said, if you don't vote with us in the UN, why should we give you any aid? Well, aid should be a need-based thing. And unfortunately, though, it's used as a club or as a way to leverage the countries that you're supporting into backing you in return.
Right.
So there's all kinds of inequalities that are needing attention as far as real problems in the world that don't get solved because the bigger countries tend to have their own interests at stake.
So we have our first question from our audience.
Great.
His name is Thomas Hayes. He's asking, what are some courses in your department that you would recommend?
Okay, Peace and Conflict Studies is not a department, it's a co-major, it's a center, and we offer a number of very interesting courses. Obviously, the introduction to Peace and Conflict Studies gets you into how to analyze conflict and maybe remedy it. We offer a course in dispute resolution, how do you negotiate better, taught by the way, a labor mediator. It's a very popular course. A Studies in Nonviolence course is available. We have a number of special topics courses which grab interest in human trafficking, global health, social justice activism, things that you don't normally study in various departments which are specialized, but rather these are some kind of interdisciplinary and socially oriented, community-oriented courses, and they can get you out there into an internship too. We have an internship course, so you can work in an agency
Cool.
and get practical experience. So I think it's really a cool co-major and adds a lot of potential. At the graduate level, we have a graduate certificate to add to a master's curriculum on peace and security, where we'll consider border issues, border security questions. We've got a course coming up called Walls, Barriers, and Political Geography. Kind of topical these days. These are courses that we offer that are kind of cool. By the way, I want to mention 2 events coming up that the center is sponsoring, holding in what we call a Peace Weekend in April 20th, the weekend of April 20th. One of these is Peace in the Streets Conference in conjunction with Rotary International, the Detroit Rotary Club and the Ann Arbor Club, to attract young people, college and high school age, to come and over 2 days consider peace in the hood, peace in the home, and peace in the schools. Well, with what's happening in schools these days, it's a very timely event to consider how do we tone down the violence. But of course, shootings in neighborhoods, drug addiction issues, domestic violence, and human trafficking All these kinds of things will be covered by some experts, and interactive panels will take place on the 20th and 21st here at Wayne State at the Law School. We'll end that conference with something called Hands Across the Mile Roads, which is a trip to a wall, the Burwood Wall, which not many people know about, in northwest Detroit, which was an actual wall. It's still there, with like the Berlin Wall, with murals on it now, painted. But it was to divide a black neighborhood from a white neighborhood officially, so that the whites could get federal loans in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
That was a federal requirement, that you could not live in an integrated neighborhood to get home loans for the white community. So that is a very stark reminder of where we've come from and progress. But we're going to then go from there to 8 Mile. It's near 8 Mile. We're going to walk to 8 Mile. We're going to hold hands legally to cross the road and symbolize unity in our community, which is vastly needed. That's the Saturday, the Friday and the Saturday. On Sunday, we're going to have a Peacemaker Award and Peace Lecture taking place at the Fort Street Presbyterian Church from 11 o'clock on. And the main speaker will be Dr. Izzeldin Abu Aleish, who's the famous Palestinian doctor from Gaza, who in 2009 lost 3 daughters in his house while he was there in a misguided Israeli tank attack on his house.
Wow.
And he immediately got on the phone and tried to call desperately for help to the Israeli TV people that he was friends with, because he's a doctor who practiced for both Israelis and Palestinians, obstetrician. And he became famous in Israel for his plea for help. Since then, he's gone on to campaign, and he's written a book called I Shall Not Hate, which is desperately campaigning to have peace between these communities and other communities. And he has a foundation to help Middle East women get better educated and advanced. So he's going to be our main speaker on the 22nd at the Peacemaker Awards. We'll also be honoring local peacemakers, State Senator Martha Scott, and some other folks who have made a difference in our communities, bringing people together. And that's a free event with some refreshments and stuff, so people are invited to that.
Do students
That's
need
great.
to reserve a spot, or can they just show up?
It's desired that you have an RSVP. We'll have an online link for that very shortly under Peace in the Streets designation or Peacemaker designation for the 2 events.
Okay, yeah, that sounds very interesting.
Okay.
And I think that's our time for the show today. We want to thank our listener, and we want to thank Sal, our electrician, and that's it. Have a good day, everyone.
All right. Goodbye.
So long.